In the golden light of dawn, before a single servant stirred or a single bell rang across the courtyards, a medieval castle already breathed with ancient purpose. Its stone walls had absorbed centuries of secrets, whispered conspiracies, quiet prayers, the distant thunder of approaching armies, and the soft laughter of children born to wear crowns. This was no ordinary building. It was a living organism, a monument to ambition, faith, and the relentless human desire for power and permanence. Moss crept slowly between the joints of ancient stone. Ravens nested in the highest towers. The moat reflected the pale sky like a mirror held up to heaven. And at the heart of all this magnificent weight, wrapped in ermine and silk, slept a king. The morning ritual of a medieval monarch began long before he opened his eyes. Servants had been awake since the darkest hours of the night, stoking fires in the great hearths, heating water scented with rosemary and lavender, laying out garments of impossible richness, robes lined with the fur of animals hunted in distant northern forests, belts encrusted with gems that had crossed deserts on the backs of merchant camels. Nothing about the royal morning was casual or spontaneous. Every detail had been rehearsed 1,000 times, governed by tradition so old that no living person could remember its origins. The king did not simply get dressed. He was constructed layer by careful layer into the image of divine authority that his kingdom required him to be. A crown was not merely an object of gold and jewels. It was a burden made visible, a daily reminder of everything that had been sacrificed and everything that was still owed. Inside the royal bedchamber, the walls themselves seemed to speak of power. Tapestries of gold thread and imported silk depicted great battles won, treaties signed, and saints interceding on behalf of the royal bloodline. The ceiling was painted with scenes from scripture, reminding the king, and anyone fortunate enough to enter, that his authority descended not merely from his ancestors, but from God himself. The canopied bed, draped in the finest woven fabrics available anywhere in the known world, was not simply a place of rest. It was a throne of sleep, a sacred space where the body of the sovereign was renewed each night so that he could carry the weight of his people another day. Even the pillows were stuffed with the softest goose down, imported at considerable expense, because a king who slept poorly judged poorly, and a king who judged poorly did not remain a king for long. When the monarch finally emerged from his chambers, every appearance was a performance, carefully staged and loaded with symbolism. The way he walked, unhurried, deliberate, chin slightly raised, communicated volumes without a single word. His clothing spoke before he did. Colors carried meaning. Crimson spoke of blood and sacrifice. Gold announced divine favor. Deep blue whispered of loyalty and the infinite sky above all kingdoms. The ermine trim framing his robes was reserved exclusively for royalty. To wear it without permission was a crime punishable by ruin or worse. Even his gloves, his rings, the chain of office resting against his chest were carefully chosen instruments of communication in a world where many of his subjects could not read a single written word. The king's body was itself a text, and every subject who laid eyes upon him was reading it, whether they understood that or not. Breakfast in a medieval castle was nothing like the quiet, private meal most people imagine. The Great Hall, an enormous, echoing space with ceilings so high that torchlight barely reached them, came alive each morning with the organized chaos of a small kingdom feeding itself. Long tables stretched the full length of the room, already laden with polished silver plates, warm bread that filled the air with a yeasty and comforting warmth, roasted meats glistening from the spit, and wines imported from distant vineyards across the sea. Servants moved in careful choreography between the kitchen and the hall, their footsteps trained to be near silent, even as they carried platters heavy enough to test the strongest arms. Dogs lounged beneath the tables, waiting patiently for scraps, their presence tolerated because they too were part of the ecosystem of the Great Hall, useful, loyal, and entirely dependent on the generosity of the crown. The king did not eat among his people as an equal. He sat at the high table, elevated on a dais that placed him physically above every other soul in the room, a deliberate architectural statement that required no explanation. Every bite he took was watched, every cup he raised was noted. The ritual of the royal meal served a purpose far beyond simple nourishment. Loyalty, as effectively as any oath sworn on a blade. Food itself was a weapon of diplomacy. Exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, were worth more than most peasants earned in a year, and their presence on the royal table announced that this kingdom had connections reaching to the farthest edges of the known world. The ledgers show a discrepancy in the eastern revenues. I will investigate. Elaborate sugar sculptures fashioned into castles and coats of arms were placed along the table not to be eaten but to be admired. Proof that the royal household employed artists as well as soldiers. A visiting foreign ambassador sitting at that table was meant to leave with one clear impression. The ledgers confirm our reserves are strong. This king is wealthy, well-connected, and not to be underestimated. Every course that arrived was a chapter in a story being told entirely in the language of abundance. Morning court followed soon after, and here the real business of kingship began in earnest. The throne room received a steady procession of humanity. Petitioners knelt on cold stone floors, their voices carefully balanced between desperation and respect. A widow seeking justice for stolen land. A merchant requesting a trading charter. A minor lord offering tribute in exchange for military protection. A priest bearing news from Rome that would require careful navigation between faith and politics. Each case was presented, argued, and decided with a speed that modern courts would find astonishing. The king could not afford to dwell. There were hundreds of decisions to be made each week, and hesitation was itself a form of weakness that enemies would notice and remember. Every judgment rendered in that hall echoed outward through the kingdom like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples reaching villages and borders that the king himself might never visit in his lifetime. The royal advisors who flanked the throne were not merely decorative. These were men who had survived the brutal politics of court life long enough to become indispensable. They carried in their heads a vast archive of precedent, alliance, obligation, and threat that the king could not possibly hold alone. A great king knew which of them to trust and which to watch carefully. The most dangerous men in any castle were not the ones who stood against the king openly. Those were easy to identify. The truly dangerous ones were the smiling advisors who whispered in the right ear at the right moment, arranging for the right information to reach the king's attention while other, equally important information was quietly buried. Courts ran on knowledge, and knowledge, in the right hands, was more powerful than any army. Beyond the throne room, the castle sprawled in a complex hierarchy of spaces, each one a kingdom within the kingdom. The kitchens were a world unto themselves, vast, sweltering, perpetually in motion. Master cooks commanded their domains with an authority that rivaled any general, shouting orders over the roar of open fires large enough to roast an entire ox. The amount of food consumed by a busy royal household was staggering. Accounts from medieval castles record the weekly purchase of hundreds of loaves, dozens of carcasses, barrels of ale and wine, and quantities of spice that would seem extraordinary even by modern standards. Feeding a court was a logistical campaign in its own right, requiring supply chains that stretched across the kingdom and relationships with merchants, farmers, and huntsmen that had to be carefully maintained year after year. The stables occupied an entire wing of the outer castle grounds, and their importance cannot be overstated. Horses were not merely transport, they were status. They were military might made flesh and bone. The royal destrier, bred specifically for battle, was an animal of extraordinary power and value, worth more than the annual income of most minor lords. Stable hands cared for these animals under demanding conditions, knowing that the health of the king's horses could determine the outcome of campaigns and, by extension, the fate of the kingdom itself. A well-mounted king arrived to battle with an advantage that went beyond speed or strength. He arrived as a symbol, elevated above the bloodshed on an animal that seemed to the terrified foot soldier below as something more than natural. In the armory, swords, lances, and suits of plate armor stood in polished rows, tended by specialists who understood that a poorly maintained weapon could cost a king his life. The royal armorers were craftsmen of the highest order, their workshops humming constantly with hammer on metal and files smoothing edges to a razor sharpness. The king visited regularly, not merely to inspect, but because there was something genuinely compelling about the weight of a well-made sword, the cold perfection of a visor sealed shut, the knowledge that these instruments of steel stood between his people and whatever darkness gathered beyond the borders of the realm. War was never far from the medieval mind, and a king who forgot that never ruled for long. The royal hunt was more than sport. In a world without newspapers or public announcements, the hunt was theater, and the king was always the lead performer, riding at the head of a thundering party through ancient forest, a falcon balanced on his gloved wrist, hounds racing ahead with joyous purpose. The king was visible in a way that reinforced his authority far more effectively than any written proclamation. Local people lined the edges of forest paths to watch. They carried home stories of the king's horsemanship, his courage, the size of the animal he brought down. These stories spread from village to village, growing with each retelling until the monarch became something larger than a man, a figure of legend moving through the world in real time, close enough to see but remote enough to inspire awe. The royal gardens offered a different kind of theater entirely. Rare flowers, imported from distant kingdoms, bloomed in geometric patterns that spoke of order imposed upon nature, the same order the king imposed upon his realm. Sculpted hedges created private spaces for conversation that could not be overheard. Marble fountains danced in the afternoon light, their sound masking the words of men who were deciding the fates of thousands. When the king walked here with his advisors, it was not leisure. It was a mobile council chamber with better air, where the removal from the formal setting of the throne room allowed a different kind of honesty to emerge. Some of the most consequential decisions in medieval history were made in gardens exactly like these, between men who had lowered their guard just far enough to speak plainly. The castle chapel occupied a space of profound importance in the daily rhythm of royal life. Prayer was not optional for a medieval king. It was constitutional, as essential to his rule as the army or the treasury. He was, in the eyes of his people,
These ancient
God's
scrolls
chosen
reveal the empire's
representative
foundations,
on
the
earth.
rivers and mountains shaped
And if
our
he
history.
failed to honor that
Study these
relationship
maps
with
to
the
understand
appropriate
strategy.
devotion,
shows great
the
promise.
entire spiritual
Your
contract
Highness,
upon
this
which
map
his
shows the
authority
ancient trade
rested
routes.
began to
And these books
unravel.
describe the voyages.
He knelt
Precisely.
on cold
They are key
stone
to our
before
history.
gilded altars,
He shows great
heard
promise.
Mass in Latin he had been taught since childhood, and made offerings that were
Observe the
simultaneously
ancient trade
acts of
routes, Your
genuine
Highness.
piety and carefully
Precisely,
observed
divine.
public theater.
This blade
The
will
priests
serve
who
the realm
served
well.
the royal chapel
Fine
were
edge,
also
Your Majesty.
political actors,
Indeed.
their
Let it be
sermons
tested in
capable
battle.
of shaping how the court understood the king's latest
Behold
campaign
the
or
new blade. Let
controversial
us test its
judgment.
metal.
As twilight settled and the great torches were lit
Fine
along
edge.
the
It
battlements,
will serve us
the
well
rhythm
in
of the
battle.
day slowed
This steel
without
has
ever
been tested in
truly
the forge.
stopping.
Now it
The
faces my
evening
hand.
meal was another
Feel the balance.
performance,
A true king's
longer,
blade.
more
serve
elaborate,
the realm well.
sometimes accompanied by musicians
Behold, my
whose
queen,
task
our
was to
kingdom
fill the
stretches
great
as far as
hall
the
with
eye can
sound that matched
It
the
is magnificent,
grandeur
my
of the
king, a
setting.
legacy we shall cherish.
Lutes, harps, and
Together we
drums
shall.
created a soundscape of civilized pleasure
king, this
that
moment is
reminded
ours.
every person in the hall that they were living
this kingdom
inside
is ours
something
to cherish.
exceptional. After dinner came entertainment, traveling performers who had crossed kingdoms to earn a single knight's coin, scholars debating philosophy while the king listened with genuine curiosity, readings from poetry that celebrated the very life being lived inside those walls. The king presided over all of it with the particular exhausted alertness of a man who had been performing since the moment he opened his eyes and understood, without needing to be told, that he could not yet stop. In the private hours before sleep, when the last candle burned low and the castle settled into its nighttime rhythms, the changing of the guard, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of ancient timber contracting in the cold, a king was perhaps most himself. The letters and journals that survive from medieval monarchs reveal men who worried about their children, questioned their own decisions, mourned friends lost to war and plague, and the casual cruelty of fate, and prayed with a fervor that had nothing theatrical about it. To be a king in a castle was to inhabit the most magnificent cage ever built, surrounded by beauty, attended by hundreds, celebrated by thousands, and profoundly, irreducibly alone. The crown that gleamed on its velvet cushion across the room was the last thing he saw before closing his eyes, and the first thing he thought of when he opened them again. Yet the cycle continued, as it always had and always would. The drawbridge rose, the sentries changed, the fires burned low and were built back up again by hands that never rested. And when the first pale light of a new dawn touched the highest turret and set the royal banner trembling in the cold morning air, the great machinery of kingship began again. Unchanged, unrelenting, and as necessary as breathing to a civilization that had built its entire world, its faith, its identity, and its future around one man's crown. This was how kings lived. Not as ordinary men who happened to own castles, but as the living center of a universe that could not exist without them, and knew it.